A round of applause for Ema Sullivan-Bissett.
Okay. Ooh. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, I'm not mic fluent, so this is my first time being mic'd up. Thank you all for coming and for being invited. This is really lovely. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you about one of my favourite topics of research, which is delusional belief. And if you'll excuse the clickbait title, although it did get bums on seats, which is a big surprise to me, given that there's a panel on sex going on, upstairs. So please don't leave if you didn't already know that. So what I'm going to try to do today is convince you that my preferred theory of delusion formation is correct. That's the goal. But first, I want to just clear out some of the things that I don't mean when I talk about delusional belief, right? So I take it there's a kind of pub use of the term delusion, right? So if me and my partner are having a drink and he's been particularly naive, he might say something like, Tottenham are going to win the FA Cup this year, or whatever it is footballers do, right? And I might say something like, come on, hon, you're delusional, right? That's not the kind of use that I'm interested in. Sorry for any Spurs fans in. If your name is Richard Dawkins, and I don't think that applies to anybody here, but you'll take it that if you have a belief in God or any kind of deity, then you are delusional, right? And again, that's not the kind of use of the word that I'm interested in. So my target is clinical delusions, those occurring in the clinical population. And my question is, what on earth is going on there, right? Why do people have these very, very strange beliefs? Okay. Now, before I come on to delusion, I want to try and get you to see that the business of explaining ordinary belief is actually not a terribly interesting or difficult business, right? And I'll just give you some examples of that so you can see. So here's one. Let's say I have the belief that Rishi Sunak is the Prime Minister of the UK, and yes, these slides had to be redrafted recently. And it could have changed, right? Because I did these yesterday, right? So let's assume that's true. Now, how would you explain why I believe that? Well, you might say something like this. Emma keeps up with the news. She has a subscription to The New Statesman. She listens to lots of politics podcasts. She's a total nerd, basically, right? This is the kind of thing that she would believe. Now, you might think, well, that explanation comes easy because that belief is true, right? So you just kind of look out into the world and you say, well, Emma believes it because it's kind of true. But it's actually not that difficult to explain lots of false beliefs as well, right? So here's another example. So let's say that Sarah has the belief that the Great British Bake Off is on at 8 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. And let's say that, her mate John told her that because he's got a really weird sense of humor. Now, if you wanted to explain why Sarah has the false belief that the Great British Bake Off is on at 8 o'clock, you're going to say, well, John told her and she trusted him, and that's that. It's not terribly interesting why she has that false belief, and we can perfectly well understand it, right? Okay. Slightly harder case, back to my partner. So Phil's belief that Tottenham Hotspur are the best team in the Premier League. Now, why does Phil believe that? Now, it's not because it's true, right? So I remind him often that Spurs haven't won a trophy for 14 years, right? So it's not because it's true that he believes that. But I still think that we can kind of give some kind of explanation, right? Now, here's not the place to do any hack sort of psychology of sporting allegiance, but I take it we're going to say something like, well, he really wants it to be true that Tottenham are the best team in the Premier League, and so a bit of wishful thinking, some cognitive biases, we'll get to our explanation, right? It's not terribly interesting. Okay, so I hope that's helped you see that when we want to explain kind of ordinary belief, even ordinary false belief, it's not actually that difficult, might not be that interesting. And what I want to get you to is the thought that, gosh, delusions are so weird, how on earth do we explain those, right? I take it that these are much more difficult to explain. I can't give a quick 1-minute explanation of what's going on in those cases. Okay, so as everybody in the history of the world has done when they do a talk on delusion, let's start with the definitions found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. This won't be boring, honestly. They'll just do this quick bit and then the rest will be fun. So in DSM-4 in 2000, a delusion is described as a belief based on incorrect inference, which is firmly sustained despite what almost everyone else believes and despite what constitutes incontrovertible and obvious proof or evidence to the contrary. I will give you some examples in a minute because this is very dry indeed. Things get a bit softer in 2013. A delusion is a belief which is held despite clear or reasonable contradictory evidence regarding its veracity. Okay, so those are the clinical definitions. Now, I could give a whole talk on objections to those clinical definitions, but to be honest, it's not that interesting. So what I'm going to do instead is just give you a couple of examples so you've got the phenomenon in mind, the kind of thing that I'm interested in. So here are some examples illustrated with some lovely icons by philosopher Richard Dubb from Geneva, used with his permission. So here's one example, the Capgras delusion. So this is the belief that one's loved one has been replaced by an imposter. Right? So if I had the Capgras delusion, I might return home one day, cast eyes upon my son, and say, that's not my son, right? It looks an awful lot like my son, right? It's very cute, but that's not my son, right? He's been replaced by an imposter, probably for nefarious reasons, right? But that's not my child. And just to be clear, it definitely is my child, right? So the delusion is, it's not my child, but in fact it is. Another example is Cotard delusion. So this is the delusion that you are dead, or you've ceased existing, or sometimes that your internal organs are rotting, right? That kind of theme. Which is interesting in itself because it kind of sounds self-contradictory, right? If you can speak, if you can tell me you're dead, probably not dead, right? So that's a really interesting case. Here's another one, delusions of erotomania. So this is the delusion that somebody, usually of a higher status, who you've never met, right, is in love with you. So if I have this delusion, I might say something like, Idris Elba's in love with me. You guys wouldn't understand, but he sends me secret messages on the number plates of purple cars in Manchester, right? And it's a real special thing. Blah, blah. Okay, one more that Richard hasn't designed an icon for, but will be important later, is delusional bicephaly, which is the belief that you have a second head. Okay, so those are the cases I'm interested in, and I hope you're thinking, good luck explaining that, right? Why do people have those beliefs? Super weird. Okay, so that's the question I'm now going to answer. But first of all, I just want to narrow my remit a little bit, distinguish between two types of delusion, and tell you that I'm going to focus on one of them. So there's monothematic delusions. So those are delusions which concern a single theme, and they occur in the mental economy of people who are otherwise well, right? So they don't have this whole swathe of strange beliefs. They just have this one thing, right? They just believe that their son has been replaced by an imposter, but kind of all their other beliefs are largely unaffected. And then there's polythematic delusions. Now, these are much more elaborate. They occur in the context of broader mental disorders, and the person here might have lots and lots and lots of delusional beliefs. Okay, so I am interested in monothematic delusions. And you might think, is that because they suit your preferred theory? Well, yes, they happen to, but also they were the target of the opposing theory. So when my opponents were developing their view, they were also focused on the monothematic cases, right? So that is shared ground. Okay, so what do we know about monothematic delusions, other than that they're super weird beliefs? Well, one thing we know is that they are often associated with some highly anomalous experiences. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of experiences people with delusions undergo. But before I do that, I need to give you a bit of background. So, in non-delusional subjects, in healthy people, when they look at familiar faces, they have what we call an affective response, which means that it's something it feels like to see a familiar face, which is different from what it feels like to see a face that you've never seen before, okay? It's quite hard to articulate exactly what that means, but think of it like this. So you see someone in a crowded room and you think, I've seen them before, right? Before you've kind of got their name. Have we met before? That kind of feeling. Or recognizing an actor on TV, right? If you're anything like me, you're like, where have I seen IMDb, right? Because I don't have the cognitive powers to do that. My partner, on the other hand, says, oh, they were playing a 6-year-old 25 years ago in a black and white movie no one's ever seen. It's remarkable. But that kind of feeling, oh, I've seen that face before. And we are to suppose that when you have that response, when you look at a loved one, your husband, your son, your wife, whatever it is, that response is kind of stronger still. Even though, because it's an everyday experience, right, you might see your son a lot, you might not, on reflection, think that it's particularly remarkable, but we are to suppose that you have this response. And the flip side is, when we see a face entirely unfamiliar to us, you don't have any kind of response of this kind, right? So I look out onto this sea of faces, I feel nothing. Nothing at all, right? But that's not because I don't like you, it's because I've never seen your faces before. You're just blank canvas to me. Okay, so I don't have any kind of effective response. Right, why have I told you all of that? Well, because in Capgras subjects, so remember those are the people who believe that their loved ones have been replaced by an imposter, when they look upon a loved one, due to this neurological damage, which is above my pay grade to explain, so that's just on the slide, due to this neurological damage, when they look at a loved one, they don't have the effective response. Okay, so it feels as though they're looking at a stranger. Super weird. But not only does it feel as though they're looking at a stranger, they're looking at a stranger who looks extraordinarily like their son or their wife or their husband, right? So, whoa, gosh, that looks, but I don't feel anything, right? That must be a very strange experience indeed. Okay, so that's the Capgras experience. In Cotard subjects, so remember this is the belief that one is dead or has ceased existing. One hypothesis at the moment is that that lack of effective response that Capgras subjects have when they look upon their sons, their husbands, their wives, that's generalized to the person's entire environment. So they have this very widespread experience as of kind of absence, emptiness, something's missing. Okay? And just one more, delusional bicephaly. So this is the delusion that one has a second head. This is kind of easier to make out. And there are cases in the literature where people describe things in these terms. People have visual and auditory hallucinations as of a second head, right? That's kind of much easier to understand. And there's a case in 1984 that Amos reports on of a man who lost his wife and he saw on his shoulder that of her doctor with whom she was having an affair, okay? And he said this about his experience. Oh, and I should add, this is an important detail. He tried to shoot that second head off. And it was successful in that the delusion resolved, and he survived. So that's good, but he died some years later from his injuries. But this is what he said about his experiences. The other head kept trying to dominate my normal head, and I would not let it. It kept trying to say to me I would lose, and I said, bullshit. I am the kingpin here, it said. And it kept going on like that for about 3 weeks, until finally I got jack of it, I decided to shoot my other head off. Okay, so hopefully you see that the kinds of experiences that people with delusions have are pretty profound, highly distressing, highly systematic, etc., etc. Okay, so now I want to jump into the debate that I'm interested in, which is empiricism about delusion formation. So empiricists say those anomalous experiences that I've just spent 5 minutes explaining, don't ignore that, right? That's going to be a really key ingredient if you want to explain why Emma believes that her son's an imposter, why Sarah believes she has a second head, etc. Right? So pay attention to those experiences. They're going to be part of our explanatory toolbox if we want to tell a story about why people have those beliefs. That's what empiricism says. So if you want, there'll be one picture of my son in here. I'm not going to be a baby bore, but he is only 13 weeks old and he's very cute. So there he is. So if you want to explain why Emma believes that her son has been replaced by an imposter, you had better pay attention to the fact that when she looks at her son, she feels nothing, right? He's actually in the room, so hopefully that's not going to damage him for life. I love you. And if you want to explain why Amira believes that she has a second head, pay attention to the fact that when she kind of looks over here, she sees and hears a second head, right? That's really going to be important. Okay, so that's the kind of game I'm in. Everybody who's in the debate that I'm interested in agrees on that much. Okay, so where's the disagreement? Well, here's the next question we ask. How many factors are involved in delusion formation? What's a factor? Obviously, that's going to be crucial to talking about any debate about how many there are. Well, to put it really crudely, a factor is something that goes wrong with somebody with a delusional belief. It's something which is a clinical abnormality. Something which is explanatorily relevant to the project of explaining delusional belief in particular, rather than ordinary belief. Now, a factor isn't merely a cause, right? If we want to explain ordinary beliefs, we're going to have to appeal to dozens of factors, right? The fact that there's oxygen in the person's environment, the fact that the person has the relevant mental capacities, and so on and so on and so on. That's not what we mean by factor. We mean something that's clinically significant, something that's abnormal, not found in the healthy population. That's what we mean by factor. And empiricists all agree, so this is not up for grabs, I shan't be taking questions on this, I will really, but empiricists all agree that anomalous experience, the kinds of experiences I've just explained, are a factor. They're a clinical abnormality. Okay. Now, we can think in terms of a normal range for experience to kind of get this idea on the table. So here's our normal range. And at one position in the range, you might have ordinary perceptual experiences, right? Your perceptual experience as of me on the stage, my perceptual experience as of all these faces that I feel nothing for, etc., right? Ordinary perceptual experiences. Also in that range, dreams. They're pretty weird if you think about it, right? Unless you're me with a 13-week-old. You will go to sleep at night, right? And you will have these weird and wonderful experiences, and then you'll just get on with your day. But let's just take a moment. That's pretty a weird thing that happens to us, but perfectly normal, right? Again, if it doesn't happen too often, déjà vu, perfectly normal experience, the feeling that this has happened before. And also nighttime hallucinations. These are very common. They happen in about a third of healthy individuals. Nothing to worry about. And everybody agrees that delusional experience, so feeling nothing when you look at your loved one, seeing a second head on your shoulder, having that feeling of emptiness generalized to your entire environment, that's not in the normal range. That's clinically significant. Okay. Ooh. I promise you, that was an accident. I added that today, and okay, that's weird. Great. So, if you are a one-factor theorist, you will stop there. You'll get off the bus. You'll say those strange experiences that people with delusions have, that's the only thing that's going wrong. That's the only thing about them that's outside of the normal range. So one thing goes wrong with people with delusions, and that is that they have clinically abnormal experiences. And you might be thinking, what are you trying to rule out? Like, what is it they're not saying? Well, they're not saying that the reasoning is abnormal. In fact, Brendan Maher, the most famous one-factor theorist, said, the ways in which delusional beliefs are formed differ in no important respect from the ways in which beliefs of normal subjects are formed. So that's the one-factor account. Okay, the two-factor account, you'll never guess what, that says there are two things going wrong. So the first thing the two-factor theory says is, you're absolutely right. Those strange experiences are clinically abnormal, they count as a factor. But that's not the end of the story. We also need to say that the reasoning of subjects with delusions is outside of the normal range, the way in which they form their beliefs or the way in which they respond to evidence. Something's going terribly wrong there as well as the strange experience. So two things go wrong, a strange experience and faulty reasoning. Now, I've not got time to go into the details here, but that's cashed out in terms of a particular kind of reasoning bias or a reasoning deficit. But the key point is, whatever's going on in people with delusions in the way they form and maintain their beliefs is abnormal. It's clinically significant. And again, we can talk about a normal range for reasoning. So at one end of the range, you might have super rational people. I flatter myself, philosophers, right? But I also flatter you, skeptics, right? You might be at one position in that range. A bit further along that range, but still perfectly normal, kind of unremarkable, conspiracy theorists, right? We've all got an uncle who thinks the moon landing was faked, right? It's not just me, right? That's the thing. Perfectly normal range, right? You don't think that that's clinically significant. You kind of wish there was less of it about, but you know. People who believe in telepathy, spiritual mediums, other kind of weird phenomena, perfectly normal. Not necessarily rational, but perfectly normal. Now, the one-factor theorists will say, well, I don't really have a view about where people with delusions sit in this normal range, kind of maybe here, maybe here. No reason to suppose that their reasoning is kind of homogeneous, right? If she's sensible, she'll say, well, that's case-by-case basis, right? Some people with delusions are kind of like this, and some people are like this, but whatever, I'm kind of agnostic, but it's normal. The two-factor theorists will say, no, that's going wrong as well. That's an abnormal feature of them. Okay. Is everybody clear on the one and the two-factor account, roughly? Good. So, just for my own interest, straw poll, just see where people are by show of hands. So who thinks that the one-factor account has got it roughly right? So people have very strange experiences, but they reason in a kind of perfectly ordinary way. Okay, maybe about 20%. And who thinks the two-factor account is right? So very strange experiences, but they reason in a very bad way. Oh, I got a job to do. Okay, all right. Well, if you're a two-factor theorist, you are in the majority, and that is the orthodox view. In fact, Basically, nobody is a one-factor theorist, and yet it doesn't put me off. I just think everybody else is wrong. So I've been, in the last few years, working on this topic and published some papers on my own and also with my co-investigator, Professor Paul Nordhoff at the University of York. We are one-factor theorists. We basically don't have any friends in that particular... everybody's a two-factor theorist in this debate, okay? And yeah, I think they're making a mistake. I'm going to try and convince you of that in the time that I have remaining. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, and I realize that given the audience today, this might not work very well because you're probably wise to these tricks. But what I'm going to try and do is alienate you, make you look pretty dumb, and then say, you see, you're not so bright either. But I think that the audience is going to probably have seen this before. But trust me, most people get this wrong, okay? So what I'm going to do is give you a piece of information, then I'm going to ask you to vote on which of two statements is more probable. Okay, so here's your piece of information. Linda's 31 years old. She's single, outspoken. She's very bright. She majored in philosophy as a student. She was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Okay, there's your information about Linda. I'm sure many of you have seen this before. Okay, two options. Do you think Linda is a bank clerk or do you think Linda is a feminist bank clerk? So, option one, Linda is a bank clerk, show of hands. Okay, option two, Linda is a feminist bank clerk, show of hands. Okay, I was right, this is a very clever audience. Okay, so 80% of people in trials get this wrong. So let's assume we have a room where that just happened. So if you said option two, which was about 3 of you, you committed the conjunction fallacy. Okay, so what's a conjunction? A conjunction is a sentence which says 2 things about the world. So we are in Manchester and it is raining today. 2 things are said. We are in Manchester, it is raining. Here's a logical truth about conjunctions. The whole statement is not more probable, cannot be more probable than either of its components. Okay, so I gave you a conjunction when I said Linda is a feminist and, sneaky and in there, it was implied, Linda is a bank clerk. Okay. More things have to be true of the world for 2 to be true than for 1 to be true. So it just can't be the case that number 2 is more probable than number 1. Take anybody in the world, right? Randomly select a person in the world. It's more probable they're a mere bank clerk, no offense to bank clerks, than a bank clerk and in addition, a feminist, right? More things have to be true for that to be the case. Even for Linda, right, and that's the point, who seems like, well, she's going to grow up to be a good feminist, isn't she? Even for her, it's more likely that she's merely a bank clerk than a bank clerk and a feminist. Okay. Now, 80% of people get that wrong. That didn't happen here. That's the first time that's not happened, by the way. Usually that goes beautifully. Everyone's like, 2 is true. And I'm like, no, it isn't. But never mind. You believe me that most people get that wrong. Okay. Which is to demonstrate that members of the non-delusional healthy population don't reason very well. And in bigger versions of this talk, I go through a few of these exercises, and people just consistently get them wrong. But I'm not going to come back to this audience, so because that did not go well. So members of the non-delusional healthy population don't reason well. But also, by the way, they've got some really weird beliefs, as you all well know, right? So non-delusional subjects are prone to believe in the Bermuda Triangle, flying saucers, spoon bending by mental power, the abominable snowman, and so on and so forth, right? So not only do people in the non-delusional population not reason very well, they've also got a whole host of wacky beliefs. And remember that people with delusions are seeking to respond to some highly anomalous experiences, okay? So here's what I want to say to the two-factor theorist, right? Look around you, okay? The reasoning of non-delusional folk leaves an awful lot to be desired. I think there's a temptation, especially in academia, to think everybody is Bayesian rational, right? Nobody could possibly believe something like that. But come on, go out on the street, talk to ordinary people. They have all sorts of weird beliefs and they don't reason very well, right? Including people like us, maybe not people like you guys, but, you know, most people. And people with delusions are in this very strange context of having this extremely, profoundly distressing experience to which they're seeking to respond. And I also think that the burden of proof is on the two-factor theorist here, right? Because she's the one who's saying that there's a non-standard way of reasoning that people with delusions engage in. She's the one who's introducing a second clinical abnormality into our explanations. Those are massive claims, and they need an argument, right? Now, they have an argument, and I'm going to tell you what that argument is, then I'm going to respond to it, and then everyone's going to be convinced, and we all go home happy, right? That's what's going to happen. So here's the argument for a second factor, which basically all two-factor theorist papers start with, well, here's the argument, that shows the one-factor account is rubbish. Let's go on with, the nuances of the two-factor view. Okay, so here's the argument. If experiences of a subject were enough to explain delusion, it would follow that, for example, anyone who has suffered neuropsychological damage that reduces the affective response to faces should have the Capgras delusion. Anyone who has lost the ability to interact fluently with mirrors should have mirrored self-misidentification, and so on. And here's the rabbit from the hat. But they don't, right? So there are cases in the literature of people who look to have the same kind of brain damage as Capgras subjects, report that they had the same kind of experience, but they don't have Capgras delusion. So something else must be going on. Okay, that's the argument. And just to illustrate, here's a case of Emma and Gemma and their husbands, Barry and Gary. I think you'll agree I got the better looking one. And Emma and Gemma are in a car accident. They suffer the relevant neurological damage that, they go home, they look upon their husbands, and they don't feel anything. I'm not in the kind of unhappy marriage sense, but they're in the kind of affective response. I just don't feel anything. And here's what happens. So Emma goes home to Barry. She looks upon him. That's weird. But she says, right, okay, I've been in a car accident. That's causing in me this head injury and this weird experience. I don't feel the same thing as I usually feel when I look at Barry, but I know it's Barry, right? I should just see a doctor. She doesn't develop Capgras delusion, but she has the relevant experience. Things aren't so good for Gemma and her less attractive husband, so she goes home, she says, something's wrong. I don't recognize him. Something's different. That's not my husband. I've heard about body snatchers. He's an imposter. Who else is in on this? I've figured him out. That's not my Gary, right? And she develops the Capgras delusion. Okay, so here's the problem. Emma has the weird experience. Gemma has the weird experience. Now, the two-factor theorist said, if you're a one-factor theorist, they should both have Capgras delusion, right? But Emma doesn't have Capgras delusion, and Gemma does. And so what we need to do is introduce a second factor which explains why Gemma goes on to become delusional and Emma doesn't, right? That's the argument. Okay, so let's lay out our normal ranges again. So we've got our normal range for experience, and that thing's going to happen again, right? Which proves it was an accident, right? I'm not that clever. So we've got ordinary perceptual experience, dreams, déjà vu, etc., and delusional experience. And everybody agrees that Emma and Gemma have got a clinically significant experience. I take it everybody agrees that Emma's pretty rational, right? She's doing pretty well to go, oh, something's amiss here, but I'm sure everything's cool. The one-factor theorists will want to say something like this. I'm not saying Gemma's reasoning well, don't get me wrong. But the way in which she's reasoning doesn't seem any worse to me, given the context where she's seeking to respond to this highly anomalous experience, doesn't seem any worse than the way in which people, at particular points in the normal range, reason. The two-factor theorists will say, nope, she's outside of the normal range on that dimension too. Okay, so in the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to try and convince you that we should put Gemma inside of the normal range. Okay, so here's an example. Now, this is true, and not in the kind of the way comedians say, this is actually true. This is actually true, right? This really did, sorry to throw shade on your craft, but this really did happen. Okay, so my grandmother's also called Emma with one M, not an accident, and we were sat in the kitchen of her tiny, old, creaky cottage some years ago, and a candle fell over, seemingly without any provocation. So I thought, there must be a reasonable explanation, right? Okay, so Grandad must have placed that down precariously. There's a draft in the room. Let's carry on watching the chase. Everything's fine, right? My grandmother, on the other hand, not only had this thought, but vocalized it. Poltergeist playing tricks again, okay? Okay, so why have I given you this kind of insight into my very quirky grandmother's psychology? Well, because I want to get you to see that The bare fact that two people can come to radically different beliefs based upon the same experience does not give us reason to say one of those people is a clinically abnormal reasoner. That would be a crazy thing to say, I think. So let's plot us again. Super rational people, conspiracy theorists, people who believe in paranormal stuff. We both experienced a candle falling over. I say, must be a reasonable explanation. I'm not going to lose any sleep over this, right? And why do I say that? Well, because I'm a philosopher. I don't have any beliefs at all in the paranormal. I'm highly skeptical of that kind of thing. My natural reaction is to think, science has an explanation, and if it doesn't, it will do, right? That's the way I reason. My grandmother, that's her on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which I basically pushed her up. But she was well into her 70s. She did very well. My grandmother, who, has spent her life telling me that when I was a child, I saw auras and that she can read tea leaves and that she died and walked through a wall, but then decided that actually she would like to be here after all, right? So she's got this whole background set of beliefs which just prompt this kind of explanation in her, right? But I take it that we don't want to say, just because we came to different beliefs upon the same experience, we don't want to say, one of you must be reasoning in a clinically abnormal way. I say one of us, grandmother, obviously, right? If we're going to say, if something's going wrong, it's not with me. We don't need to say that, right? The normal range for belief formation strategies, capacities, is sufficiently huge. And you know this, right? As people come into a conference like this, you know that people have got very weird and wacky beliefs, and you're interested in that. That's super interesting. The normal range for human cognition is sufficiently large to tolerate different beliefs formed on the same experience. We don't need to say, oh, one of you's got a clinically significant reasoning deficit. Right? We don't need to say that at all. We just need to say, we're all a bit different, right? We have different ways of reasoning. And I think, and I don't see a reason not to say this, that we should just say the same thing about Emma and Gemma. Until you give me a reason not to, that's what I think we should say. So let's go back to them, right? So we go home, I look at Barry, I don't feel anything, but I don't become delusional. I just think, okay, something's clearly gone wrong here, and I should seek help. Gemma goes home, she looks at Gary, she thinks he's an imposter. Now, the two-factor theorist is inviting you to say, Gemma is reasoning in a clinically abnormal way. But we don't need to say that, right? We just say something like this. Emma's reasoning very well, right? She's a philosopher. She's inclined to think there are reasonable explanations, even for very strange phenomena. And so it makes more sense to her to think, something's going wrong with me, I've suffered some kind of problem, rather than jump to the idea that she's looking upon an imposter. Okay? But Gemma, she engages in certain kind of media. Maybe she privileges observational data. Maybe she thinks this kind of thing happens, right? So if you already believe that imposters are a thing, then when somebody seems like an imposter to you, then maybe you would believe that they are an imposter. But if you're somebody like me who just thinks that's science fiction and not of the good kind, right, then you're just not going to take that very seriously. But we're both normal. We're not both rational, but we're both normal, right? The normal range for the way in which people form beliefs is massive, right? We don't need to say, just because Gemma comes to a different belief from me, we don't need to say that she's reasoning in a clinically abnormal way, okay? Okay, I want to say two more things about what I'm not saying, because this is a position, and this is not subtle, which is straw-manned all the time, okay? I'm not saying that people who form delusional beliefs are responding rationally to anomalous experience. Obviously, I'm not saying that, right? They need to do much, much better. And the two-factor theorist makes a mistake when she says that the one-factor theorist has to be committed to the claim that people with delusions are forming beliefs rationally. That's never been part of the one-factor theory, and it's not part of my one-factor theory. Sidebar, though, just to complicate things, me and my co-author, I think there's a bit more road to this claim than people give credit for, actually. Not so clear where the bounds of rationality are, but I haven't argued for that today, and I don't need to argue for it in order to be a dyed-in-the-wool one-factor theorist, okay? I'm not saying it's rational, saying it's normal. And I'm also not saying this. I'm not ruling out from the armchair. Look, I'm a philosopher, right? I don't get into labs and stuff. I'm not ruling out from the armchair with a pipe in my hand that there could never be clinically significant reasoning which should be part of an explanation for why a given individual forms a delusional belief. What I am saying is that it's a mistake to take the details of that particular case to give us insight into the nature of monothematic delusion simpliciter. Sure, in some cases, something like this might be going on, but I don't think we should start there. And I don't think we should start there merely on the grounds that people come to different beliefs based upon the same experiences. Okay, so final word then. I think that the one-factor account provides a plausible and unified treatment of the nature of delusions, and I think that it deserves to be treated as a default hypothesis. The burden of proof is not on me here. I think it's on the person who says that people with delusions have got a clinically significant reasoning bias. And unless and until there is empirical evidence from the study of people with delusions that something like this is going on, and you'll just have to take my word for it that there isn't, right? At least I don't find the evidence very persuasive. Then we should all be one-factor theorists. And so, and here's the clickbait title, but I think I made good on it, there is a very real sense in which it's normal to be delusional. And now I'm hesitant to do this. Who finds the one-factor account persuasive? Oh, that's definitely gone up. That's gone up. Right, awesome. Okay, great. Who finds a two-factor account persuasive? Never mind, you can't win them all, can you? Okay. All right, thanks to my funders. I've got 2 projects ongoing at the moment. You can find us on Twitter. And thank you to all of you for listening.